This event has been organized by the PACE Project and HP Plus projects, which are supported by USAID on the sidelines of the US Government Summit for Democracy taking place later this week. My name is Lillian Benjamin, and on behalf of the US Office of Population and Reproductive Health, I'm very pleased to be here with you this morning. In the Office of Population and Reproductive Health, we are deeply committed to the multi-sectoral benefits of investments in family planning. This webinar will discuss how these benefits manifest in effective and inclusive governance, transparent and accountable institutions, and human rights in both short and long term. We have 4 speakers for today's panel. Next slide, please. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel today. Elizabeth Leahy Madison is the director of the USAID funded PACE project at the Population Reference Bureau, or PRH. Hermina Reyes directs the Health and Education Policy Plus program in Guatemala with Palladium. Chris Sims is the Deputy Chief of Party for PACE Kenya with PRB. And finally, my colleague David Jacobson is a democracy specialist with the USAID Center for Democracy, Rights, and Governance. After their presentation, there will be time for discussion and audience questions. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a couple of brief housekeeping items. During the presentation and discussion, we ask that all questions be submitted through the Zoom Q&A feature. We will be monitoring the questions submitted and will read them to the panelists. For any technical issues, please contact the host and panelists through the chat feature. Next slide, please. With that, I will hand over the floor to our first panelist, Elizabeth Leahy Madison. Elizabeth will share new analysis showing how commitment to and investment in voluntary family planning can ease the pathway to inclusive and effective governance in the long term.
Thank you so much, Lillian. On behalf of the PACE project, thank you all for joining today's event. I'm delighted to share with you the results of new analysis showing how investments in voluntary family planning, which promote changes in population age structure, can enhance countries' progress in several measures of inclusive, effective governance. Next slide, please. Population age structure, or the share of the population in key age groups, has important social and economic implications and can influence the likelihood of and pace at which countries attain their national policy goals. The analysis I'm sharing today centers on the concept of a demographic window of opportunity. As countries pass through that window, age structure evolves from becoming a drag on national development to a potential boost to development progress. One widely known way in which population change can benefit national development is through the demographic dividend. The demographic dividend is the accelerated economic growth that can happen as a population age structure becomes less youthful. The dividend is not guaranteed. It requires complementary investments in health, education, economic policy, and governance. Next slide. To open a window for the demographic dividend, a population must first progress through the demographic transition. The demographic transition is the long-term shift from high to low death and birth rates. Early in the transition, mortality rates decline while fertility remains high, resulting in a population concentrated among children and youth, like the one we see here. This type of age structure looks like a pyramid, with successively larger young cohorts at the base. Click. Once fertility declines substantially, the proportion of a country's young, economically dependent population shrinks relative to the population of working age adults. With fewer young people to support and a higher proportion of working age adults, a country has the potential to achieve a demographic dividend. Next slide. A simple way to measure age structure is by median age, the age at which half the population is older and half younger. As we will see, countries with median ages of 25 or younger tend to face significant development challenges across many sectors. Using a definition from the United Nations Population Division, we can say that the window of opportunity begins when median age reaches 26 and closes when median age reaches 41. It usually takes a country 40 to 60 years to pass through the window. This graph shows where every country of the world is today relative to the window of opportunity. About 90 countries are in the demographic window now, about 80 youthful countries have yet to enter it, and 30 older countries have already passed through it. If we look at the horizontal dotted line, we can see that with just one exception, every country that enters the demographic window has a fertility rate of less than 2.8 children per woman. Next slide. Several factors can contribute to shifts in population age structure over time. One such factor is investment in voluntary family planning. When women and couples have access to family planning services that support their individual needs and preferences, many choose to have smaller families and to invest more in the health and education of each child. As women and couples have fewer children, fertility declines and the median age of the population increases. Investments by USAID, other donors, and country governments have resulted in great progress over the past 50 years. Still, it's estimated that 218 million women in low and middle income countries have an unmet need for family planning. This map shows the percentage of demand satisfied by modern methods of family planning. Demand satisfied with modern methods is the share of women or their partners who are currently using at least one method of modern effective contraception out of the group of women of reproductive age who do not want to become pregnant in the near future. While it's not a perfect indicator of women's individual preferences, it helps us understand the proportion of women in a country who wish to avoid pregnancy and are using effective contraception. As you can see in this map, demand satisfied is lowest in sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide. The PACE project has conducted analysis that aims to broaden the classic definition of the demographic dividend. The analysis shows how age structure change can promote benefits across 4 sectors: the economy, as the dividend has classically been defined, but also health, education, and governance and stability. We do this by identifying specific points in the demographic transition at which countries cross a 50% probability threshold, meaning they become more likely than not to attain a specific level of progress in each of the 4 sectors. The analysis shows that as the median age of the population increases and becomes less youthful, countries become increasingly likely to achieve improvements across many sectors, including maternal and child survival, educational attainment, income per capita, economic transformation, government effectiveness, citizen participation, control of corruption, and political stability. Next slide. Our analysis, which builds on previous work in political demography, shows that countries with a youthful age structure are at increased risk of conflict and instability and face significant challenges building robust and effective institutions and fostering citizen participation. However, as age structure matures, a country's likelihood of effective governance and political stability progressively rises. I'm going to walk through the relationships between 4 specific benchmarks related to governance and political stability. These findings are based on statistical analysis using data from over 100 countries and the World Bank's Worldwide Governance Indicators. The first governance and stability benchmark is related to voice and accountability, defined as above average performance in citizen participation in selecting the government, freedom of expression and association, and a free media. Countries become more than 50% likely to achieve the citizen voice and accountability benchmark when the median age of the population reaches 29 years. Next slide. Countries become more than 50% likely to achieve the government effectiveness benchmark, defined as above average performance in the quality of public services, the civil service, policy formulation, and policy implementation, when the median age of the population reaches 31 years. Next slide. And countries become more than 50% likely to achieve the control of corruption benchmark, defined as above average performance of the state in serving public rather than private interests, when the median age of the population reaches 33 years. Next slide. There's also a relationship between age structure and political stability. Studies show that youthful populations are more susceptible to violence and civil unrest, particularly where high rates of poverty and unemployment exist. A country becomes more than 50% likely to achieve the political stability benchmark, defined as above average performance in the risk of politically motivated violence and instability, when the median age of the population reaches 30 years. Next slide. The four dividends analysis is effectively predictive when aggregated and applied across countries, but it doesn't account for country-specific contextual factors. The data are pooled cross-sections of annual observations, which can help us understand the probability of any given country with any given median age in any given year achieving each of the benchmarks or not. Here we show how the probabilities apply to a country like Kenya, which had a median age of 20 in 2020, and whose Vision 2030 strategy aims to achieve a democratic political system that is issue-based, people-centered, results-oriented, and accountable to the public. The analysis shows that a country with a youthful population like Kenya has a low likelihood of achieving the governance and stability benchmarks now, but that the likelihood rises as the age structure matures. This graph plots the likelihood of a country with Kenya's age structure attaining each of these benchmarks in 2050 based on projected median age if fertility rates continue to decline. The orange line on top shows the voice and accountability benchmark, which is also known as the citizen participation benchmark. With its current median age of 20, Kenya has an 18% likelihood of achieving the voice and accountability benchmark. Once the median age reaches 27, which the UN projects will happen in 2050, the probability rises to 45%. On the green line in the middle, we see Kenya's current probability of attaining the government effectiveness benchmark, which is lower at 12% given its age structure. By 2050, this likelihood rises to 35% as the projected age structure matures. And finally, in blue, we see a country's likelihood of reaching the control of corruption benchmark, which occurs latest of these three in the demographic transition. With a median age of 20, Kenya has only a 10% likelihood of attaining the benchmark. This likelihood rises to 29% in 2050 with a projected median age of 27. Now, those of you who know Kenya's demography will likely observe that these projections are based on data from a few years ago. Recent surveys have identified significant increases in use of modern contraception in Kenya, and fertility is declining more quickly than previously anticipated. These findings demonstrate how country-specific factors can accelerate a country's projected progress along the curves on this graph. Once the latest data are accounted for, projections will show a higher likelihood of Kenya reaching the governance benchmarks by mid-century. Next slide. While the four dividends analysis provides insight into the statistical connection between age structure and governance and stability, further research on the causal linkages is necessary. Current evidence points to several potential pathways through which age structure may influence governance and stability. The first is through educational attainment. As fertility declines and the median age of the population increases, educational attainment increases. Studies of democratic citizenship find that education is a consistent predictor of political engagement and electoral participation. The second pathway is through employment. Rapidly growing labor forces in slow-growing economies, often the case in youthful countries, can result in increased competition for jobs in the formal labor market, urbanization that exceeds employment growth, and migration that can disrupt community structures. These changes can increase the risk of political violence, particularly among young men experiencing unemployment. Finally, some studies have found a robust relationship between young age structures and corruption, even when accounting for economic conditions and contextual factors. Next slide. If there's one thing that this presentation has conveyed, I hope it's that investment in voluntary family planning yields a wide range of multi-sectoral benefits and is one ingredient that can contribute to effective and inclusive governance in the long term. This occurs through the mechanism of population age structure. Statistical analysis based on historical evidence demonstrates that countries with young age structures are unlikely to achieve and sustain inclusive, accountable governance or political stability. While the benefits of a maturing age structure accrue incrementally over the long term, in the short term, family planning programs can be implemented using approaches that also contribute to improved government capacity, civic participation, and accountability. We'll hear specific examples of such approaches from the next two panelists, Herminia and Chris. Next slide. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Liz. That was an amazing presentation. Up next, Herminia will share the HEP Plus Guatemala's approach to promoting accountability and transparency in family planning programming.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are in the world. It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you all today. My name is Herminia, and I serve as the country director of for HP Plus in Guatemala. Next slide, please. In Guatemala, civil participation is indispensable for promoting transparency and accountability, and to protecting people's rights to family planning, especially for indigenous people and youth. Next slide. To work on this area, we have 4 points for as our approach. In our experience, effective participation for promoting transparency and accountability requires several approaches. I will mention a few examples on how we have worked to achieve citizen participation to improve transparency and accountability in Guatemala. The first one is promoting and strengthening intersectoral mechanisms to create an enabling environment for accountability. The second is identify key actors to support demands for transparency and accountability. The third is maintaining an up-to-date playbook of actors and the legal policy mechanisms for accessing government information. And the last one is strengthening capacity to identify position and key priority issues on the public agenda with the support of citizen surveillance and analysis of data and information. Next slide, please. In Guatemala, HP Plus is taking advantage of a robust infrastructure and legal framework that was developed and supported by previous USA-supported policy projects. Part of this infrastructure include the National Contraceptive Security Commission, or CNAA, a multi-sectoral body established by law to ensure access to family planning for the Guatemalan population. As a part of the previously developed legal framework, stakeholders in the CNAA developed an alliance with civil society groups, OSAR, that is Sexual and Reproductive Health Watchdog, and OSAR Juvenil. OSAR entity explicitly focused on youth to apply the approaches mentioned above. I will now touch a few examples on this approach being into practice. Next slide, please. HP Plus has continued to strengthen the functioning of the National Contraceptive Security Commission, which allows it to better promote transparency and accountability on family planning matters. As a part of the CNAA, OSAR raised its concern and shared its perspective on this topic, promoting the application of the legal framework and decision-making on matters affecting family planning services. OSAR does this through dialogue with authorities from the Ministry of Health, Finance, and Education on progress and challenges related to improving access to family planning. Discussion topics with these authorities have included procurement and distribution of contraceptive commodity and supplies on how to budget for procurement. For example, OSAR has overseen the execution of budget allocated to reproductive health that allows the purchase of family planning inputs and payment. Next slide, please. OSAR maintains an alliance with a group of members of the Congress of the Republic. As a result of this relationship, the CNAA can engage this member of Congress individually or through congressional committees on pending and unresolved issues. This relationship leads a greater opportunity on the part of the government to follow up through on commitments. OSAR Juvenil participate in a variety of multi-sectoral tables that focus on the monitoring and implementation policy issues related to youth people, promoting the right of young people to education, information, and family planning services. These roundtables are designed to function as a space for stakeholder participation and analysis of data to verify whether the related policy legal framework is being followed. A recent success from this multi-sectoral roundtable was a renewal of the prevention through education. This is an agreement between the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, and other public and private sector actors to implement the comprehensive sexuality education strategy to promote sexual and reproductive health among youth. Next slide, please. A key strategy is to ensure that stakeholders know who the political actors are related with sexual and reproductive health issues, and the legal and policy mechanism that exists through which a stakeholder can push for accountability. For OSAR, this work is ongoing, keeping abreast of the different public officials and ensuring the government is compliant with the existing legal and policy frameworks. OSAR also use mechanisms such as its public mobile application pictured here that enable access to public information to obtain information that government institutions do not make able to the public. For example, OSAR report cases of issues impacting health such as maternal mortality, violence against girls, and instance of insufficient care at service centers to the parental authority, giving both groups the ability to verify whether these indicators are being tracked in official government system and accordance with the law. OSAR also receives alerts from its local allies about the commodities shortage and a stock out in the health facility or complaints of poor services in the facilities, which it then presents the evidence to the different commissions and committees in which it participates. Next slide, please. OSAR is an organization not just recognized by decision makers, but is also trusted by the media and private citizens. It holds press conference and conversation with journalists that help position sexual and reproductive health issues in the news and on the public agenda. On a regular basis, OSAR reports the media and the public on progress of Ministry of Health budget execution, focusing on funds allocated and expended on reproductive health and family planning. This report alerts their allies about potential delays and lost opportunity to expend allocated funds. OSAR is especially interested in transparency around financial resource and procurement mechanism. These public reporting efforts are an example of citizen oversight, which empowers the population to pay attention to issues such as family planning and its benefits, as well as challenges that exist in providing family planning services. They are also an example of citizen participation because it activates the population through traditional media and social media, which allows people share their opinions online and participate in discourse. While all the reporting and public commentary is not always positive, the important thing is that citizens are activated. As a conclusion, I am convinced that civil society has a very important role in Guatemala. It is indispensable for transparency and accountability around family planning. It is an ongoing challenge to maintain political and public interest on the right to family planning, but it's always possible for civil society to remember and demonstrate with evidence that family planning saves women's lives and decrease children's risk of malnutrition, that it helps men and women meet the educational and professional goals. In general, family planning makes it possible to create conditions for a life with dignity and hope for Guatemala. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Irina. This was another yet great presentation. We'll now have Chris, and he will share learning from PACES Kenya's experience advancing civic participation and media engagement in health policy and budgeting. Chris, you're on mute. Okay, there you are.
Thank you very much, Lillian. I'll put on the video briefly, just for those who didn't see me at the beginning, and then I'll put it off because to save some bandwidth. Chris Shem, Deputy Chief of Party for the PACE project. I'm glad to today share with you some of the lessons that we've learned. Welcome. Yeah, so I'll pick it up from where my colleague Liz left when sharing with us the 4 dividends analysis. And basically, to emphasize that this shows that investment in voluntary family planning is one ingredient that can contribute to effective and inclusive governance in the long term. To maximize this relationship in the short term, family planning program can be implemented using approaches that also contribute to improved government capacity, civic participation, and accountability. Today, I will highlight learnings from PACE Kenya on our strategy to implement family planning programs in ways that also enhance effective and inclusive governance. Next slide, please. Let me begin to situate the context in which we have implemented the PACE project in Kenya, basically looking at the national laws, policies, and strategies which establish goals and guidance on a family planning program implementation, both in the public and private sectors. In many countries, including Kenya, policy and budget decisions are increasingly devolved to subnational levels of government. However, many county governments in Kenya face capacity challenges in exercising the authorities, including in planning and budgeting. In addition, to support the locally prioritized health programs, including family planning and strong accountability, the civil society infrastructure must also devolve to the county level. The Public Finance Management Act of 2012 requires public participation in decision-making. Citizens can access local decision makers to voice priorities and concerns. County government must share sector strategies, budgets, and reports on use of public resources. Yet, both local politicians and citizens may be unaware of these requirements or unsure how to engage. Next slide, please. And the family planning financing faces quite a number of challenges. One of these is the reducing external funding for family planning, with donors increasingly requesting Kenya government to take charge of ensuring that family planning is funded by domestic resources. Because of devolution, there's also fragmentation and diseconomies of scale in providing services, family planning services. And given the fact that there are a number of disease burden in most of the counties where families are forced to spend money out of their pocket, this leads to catastrophic out-of-pocket expenditure, which pulls people into poverty, and then leads to lack of prioritization of family planning services. And then, of course, there's, as we mentioned in the previous slide, there's limited advocacy and capacity in the dividends of family planning and reproductive health success. And coupled with this, family planning also faces the challenge of effect of COVID-19, where resources were diverted, resources that were meant for family planning diverted to respond to the challenges of COVID-19. Next slide, please. Therefore, how does PACE approach working with both the national government and the county government? PACE uses a trifold approach, which focuses on strengthening individual and institutional capacity of policy decision makers and advocates. The second approach is looking at providing continuous partnership and mentorship in order to institutionalize best practices within county government. And last approach is to catalyze participation by civil society, the media, and the public for social accountability. Next slide, please. In so doing, PACE works with county health management teams who hold primary responsibility for strategic and operational planning and oversight of health services at the county level. PACE therefore provides training and mentorship to the CHMTs to build skills to interpret and use health data and to execute effective budgeting approaches, thereby enhancing effective governance. Next slide, please. In so doing, we also focus on catalyzing local advocacy and accountability through the civil society organization. So PACE programs in Kenya also support civil society organizations, citizens, and the media to participate in public budget hearings and access local decision makers to voice their priority directly, including their demand for family planning services. Further, PACE provides capacity strengthening for local CSOs to engage local decision makers in advocacy and to hold them accountable for commitments that they make. PACE also supports CSOs, including the youth-led CSOs, through training on local policy planning and budgeting process, training on accessing and interpreting and using data and evidence to influence family planning budget allocations. Next slide, please. So in catalyzing public participation for accountability using a Bunge Mashinani approach, first of all, we want to underscore that public participation for social accountability at each stage of the planning and budgeting process is an important tool to ensure citizen voices are heard and their aspirations considered. Through Bunge Mashinani, which is a social accountability initiative to inspire grassroots citizen participation in policy and the budgeting process, PACE does the following. We improve public participation in county budget forums. We create opportunities for members of the county assemblies to dialogue with citizens and respond to the community priorities at the grassroots level. And we demystify, of course, the legislation process by taking the legislation agenda at the ward level. Lastly, we increase awareness of the legislative role played by the subnational leaders. This investment contributes to governance that is inclusive and reflects priorities and concerns of the local citizens. Next slide, please. In further enhancing accountability through an informed and engaged media, finally, PACE trains media on how to accurately report on family planning priorities, data, policy processes, and the fulfillment of government commitments. Local media play a critical role in accountability, so we also create spaces for media to engage policy decision makers. We found that this media engagement catalyzed public ownership of family planning and RAMCA priorities and public participation in the budgeting process. Next slide, please. So what is the impact? Based on our engagement and technical assistance, county funding for health and family planning has increased, as I'll show in the next slide, or was protected from reduction. For example, in Narok, the county government restructured the budget to include a reproductive, maternal, newborn, child and adolescent health sub-program with a dedicated family planning line item, which means that family planning is actually now budgeted for in Narok County. And in Busia, civil society mobilization and advocacy reversed a proposed cut to the health budget in financial year 2018-2019. In Baringo and Samburu, the budget for health was increased between 3 to 8% due to civil society and PACE advocacy. Next slide, please. And this is the slide I've made reference to, which basically shows the health budget as a proportion of the total county budget based on our engagement with the county, and shows the percentages for the financial years shown on this slide. I thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Our final panelist, David, will provide reflections on avenues for collaboration in governance and in health. David?
Thank you very much. Thank you particularly to Chris and Arminia for really illustrating a lot of what I want to speak about. I'll try to be brief so that we have more time for your questions and conversation. So first of all, just wanted to note that one of the big areas of learning from the democracy, rights, and governance perspective over the years has been overcoming a challenge of kind of free rider problem that we often run into, wherein the issue sets that we talk about and frame from a democratic governance or human rights standpoint are so broad that while everybody would like to see them, greater accountability, less corruption, something like that, the marginal benefit to any individual is so small that it's difficult for them to really, outside of a few committed activists, work on the issue. And we often find that people will say they wish more was done, but they won't necessarily engage themselves. And I think one of the areas where we have learned over time we can make better progress in terms of democratic governance is having issues that will anchor engagement, whether this is, by a regional level or a topical level, parents getting involved in a parent-teacher association and something to do with schools. And so I think this is a really excellent example of where, both medical professionals and women and couples who are, issues of unmet need are forefront in their minds and they want to do something about it, will be more energized and more willing to take on the roles required to really effectively engage with government and demand their rights and kind of secure greater accountability. And then secondly, another kind of area of learning for us as a sector over the years has been the need to pre-position for windows of opportunity and to try to have programming that will take advantage of sudden, somewhat unexpected shifts, because that tends to be when meaningful progress gets made. And again, that's something where I think we've gotten better at looking for windows of opportunity and at thinking of how we can use our present day programming and long-term relationships to support champions and activists at the moments when change is possible. But I'm really struck by looking at the kind of the demographic dividends presentation on how we can perhaps be a little more strategic in anticipating, we might not know where a window of opportunity will open, but we might have a better sense of where is there greater likelihood for which kinds. So I think that's extremely helpful as well. And then two lessons that I wanted to also provide from our experience that I think are useful in collaboration around, accountability and health intersection. One is really deepening our understanding of where champions come from and what it means for there to be leadership, so that is something that is based on the political economy that obtains that have happened in Kenya. And I think we need to, depend in that example, both on the specific leadership at a county level or within a Ministry of Health or, within different, arenas, but also understand how are the forces of devolution and the kind of incentives that generates for different actors, when services are deconcentrated, but funding or personnel management remains in the metropole or something like that. where does that make openings? Where does that make change less likely? And how can we use that to frame our work to improve accountability around particular services to really fit that political economy and be most likely to be successful and be sustained? And I think that's something where, we have tended to like to see, our success mostly as a question of having good ideas and finding like-minded people to appeal to, and taking a more systemic understanding of where accountability comes from is very useful, and something that I think potentially could be helpful in terms of looking at family planning or other public health investments and accountability for them. And then secondly, I think looking at, again, a difficult thing for us to do, but looking at why a particular effort worked, the example that Armenia gave, and all of the budget information and advocacy, or the availability of budget information and kind of analysis from Kenya. In both cases, understanding that the success of the effort there is a matter of the relationships, is a matter of the civil society leadership, and is a matter of how those are coming together to fit the particular time and place, the backdrop of contestation over indigenous people's rights, for example, or the devolution and the new constitution and creation of counties in Kenya. That in both of these cases, the answer we're looking for when learning lessons around which tools and approaches worked isn't that it's a question of the tool and should we be doing social audits, or should we be doing citizen scorecards, or should we be doing budget monitoring, that it's a question of why in a given instance those tools were successful, and then how in a different situation we can borrow from those understandings to select which tools will be effective and allow us to realize mutual goals. So again, something that I think we are grappling with a lot in the DRG sector that potentially is of benefit. And then finally, just to say that I'm really excited to look beyond just how can we improve budgeting, or for family planning, or reduce unmet need, or improve population understanding and health-seeking behavior, and really starting to look at the spillovers, which I think because of our stovepiping we sometimes miss, but I bet are there. The people who are showing leadership in changing the state-society relationship around family planning, budgeting, and services are likely to take that sense of energy and agency and put it into other areas and become more engaged citizens, more meaningfully accountable leaders. And I think we need to challenge ourselves to recognize those accomplishments beyond the specific area, and become sharper at understanding when and why is it a strategic engagement for those who care about democracy to be collaborating around family planning. I think it's not always a win-win, but I think there are plenty of great opportunities that we leave on the table because from our side, we are too focused on kind of broad DRG issues, and we miss some of these motivated groups that we could be collaborating with. And from your side, I think you're often looking at it as a means to an ends of improving, family planning and, indicators and outcomes, and not paying attention to whether there are spillovers into other types of behavior. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity to look at how collaboration can allow us to really be more strategic from both sides. So I'll stop there in the interest of getting to discussion and questions, but really appreciate the opportunity and think this is very much kind of the cutting edge of collaborative, accountability and health engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. I'm sorry. Thank you, David. We now have some questions from the audience that Thank you for the 4 presenters for those excellent presentations. As a reminder, you can ask panelists questions through the Q&A feature. Before we open up questions to the audience, I'd like to ask some of our panelists some follow-up questions that we came up with ahead of time. So I will start with Armenia. Armenia, while the intersectoral mechanisms are established by government, many institutions and policies established by governments get little attention and are not effectively implemented. Why do you think the CNAA and the OSAR have overcome this barrier in advancing the FP agenda in Guatemala?
Okay, thank you for the question. First, the CNNA is established by the law. And this promotes its own sustainability and accountability of members to participate. In Guatemala, also has a civil society organization and leaders who consistently monitor for and demand compliance with family planning law. As you know, it is very important to have a law in place, the budget the money in the budget, but the most important is to monitor and demand the use of the resources in family planning. I would like to mention that USA has also consistently support capacity strengthening of CNNA. Because it's not only important to create a commission, it's very important to develop the capacity. How to develop the capacity? Providing methodology, tools, and information that help the commission and OSAR to improve the effectiveness of their activities, including the abilities to have political dialogue and capacity for monitoring and to do monitoring, the monitor and accountability exercise. This capacity strengthening has helped CNA and OSAR when they face different challenges that arise for family planning services, like the ones that I mentioned. For example, because of capacity strengthening, the Commission and the National Commission and OSAR have been able to form and keep a strategic partnership with government and institution and other civil society partners. While government and institution actors are not permanent, and this can be a challenge, civil society has more permanent leadership, which allows for the continuity and sustainability for its important work. And it's very important to involve the youth, because we need to change the leader during the time. It's very important to include a youth not only at the central level, but also at the permanent level to maintain the force to do the work that civil society had done in Guatemala. Over.
Thank you. I mean, you would think with a year on Zoom, we would have this under control, but we still have some glitches every now and again. Our next question is for Chris. And Chris, how do you foster productive relationships with the government? How do you balance collaboration and the need to play an accountability role?
Thank you, Lillian, for that question. Yeah, so I think basically looking at our approach, the PACE approach, is where we first of all ensure that as we approach to engage with the government and other partners, the first thing we do is to do a deep dive on issues that we want to engage with the government, so that one, we have data on health, and particularly for, in this particular case, family planning for each county, and how that data relates to the national. And then we also look at health data, financial data. We also dig that out and summarize, so that when we engage with the leadership at any level, first is to show the evidence And as we show the evidence, this builds trust, because one thing we've learned is that, and it speaks to what David had spoken about, is understanding how you approach and look at who are the potential champions. And you cannot have champions, for example, if you do not have information and you don't empower them with the information. So in our approach to foster collaboration is building trust by providing decision makers with the data. And we have seen this work, for example, when we engage with the members of county assembly. And what we do is provide data on health indicators in their the specific wards that they represent. This changes and flips how they think about health. And from there, they move as champions who want their wards to be very successful. So this we've seen works very well when you are open and you build trust and you provide evidence on issues that you are focusing on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I also just want to remind the audience that please feel free to add questions to using the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform if you have questions for our panelists. Our next question is for David. Could you tell us more about the local leadership, what local leadership actually means when governance and health sectors collaborate? How would you define it?
So that's a very good question and a challenging one. I think when we think about leadership, too often we implicitly view it as a top-down question, that it's where there's a kind of good leader who is, you know, benevolent and making things happen. I think real leadership tends to come more from where the forces that are driving people's behavior are open to it, and we see that it's going to be a win for various reasons for various folks involved. So maybe this is, you know, a mayor with ambitions who wants to build a reputation for being trustworthy and accountable. Maybe this is, you know, somebody in the Ministry of Finance who's trying to improve, you know, rankings on some scorecard that has to do with transparency. You know, but I think we have to understand why it's a, you know, it's in the interests of different stakeholders, and then also appreciate that different people will take on leadership at different points. And so it's almost the salience of the topic and the understanding that it's something important to make progress on, and how that connects to other frames that folks have. So, you know, one of the things I think we're often guilty of in the international development world is getting our money for particular reasons and then assuming that champions are going to be people who share the same reasons. But often people who want to overcome a conflict or want to take care of their, I don't know, veterans, or encourage more tourism might be interested in some of the things that we're looking at for their own reasons. And so we can see leadership more from some of those folks, you know, faith leaders, business leaders, other people who have different motivations. And I think we can do a better job at getting comfortable collaborating with people who use different language than we do, as long as they're willing to move forward an issue.
Thank you. Our next question is for any of our panelists or for all of the panelists. How could we better measure governance outcomes in health programs?
I can offer a start because this is something that's been a big topic of conversation in the DRG sector. And one of the more radical proposals I've seen from a professor, Matt Andrews, up at Harvard some years ago, was to say that for any governance programming, he wanted to see the proportion of citizens with birth certificates as the metric, that we should stop trying to measure some free-floating governance concept distinct from what it ultimately leads to. I think for me, that's a little bit far, but I would say that I think there's a lot of room for problems generated when we try to look at capacity to as some distinct thing that we're going to measure, because in our theory of change, it comes before behavior change. You know, I think keeping our eyes on the prize of ultimately we want more citizen oversight over the budget so that they can advocate, you know, and as in Chris's presentation, showing us here's the difference in budget that was allocated from one year to the next. You know, that's a really meaningful outcome. There have been a lot of cases where statistics get published, but nobody does anything with it, for example. So I would be cautious to generate too many different indicators rather than to treat the integrated governance as one approach in our toolkit that we can use to try to realize, you know, health outcomes. I would say that to the extent we're looking at DRG outcomes, what we would measure would be the behavior of citizens and officials. So not, you know, did the citizens, you know, what are their beliefs, but really how often in the last 6 months have they showed up at a public hearing and made their voice heard, regardless of what the topic's on. And I think starting to look at some of those things would also help to capture the spillovers where maybe somebody got excited to lead a community group through some of the family planning programming, and then they went on to also do something with a meeting around water and sanitation or education or whatever other topic because they had the sense now that they could make their voice heard. So that would be something I think would be worth measuring more as an outcome and as a spillover than as a process metric.
Chris or Herminia, anything that you would like to add?
If I can go first, I think I agree entirely with David. And for us, as we advocate for increased funding for health, the big question we ask, so if the funding increases, so what? And I think the overall picture is basically that we are looking for a better health outcome for the population. And so for me, that's the critical thing. Have we reduced cases of malaria, FP services and commodities available when mothers go to the facilities they can get these? So basically looking at the whole financing component leading to the improved health outcome across the board. Thank you.
Armenia, would you like to add anything?
Thank you. I think to have the budget to have budget, a national budget is very important. But for me, every time we face many challenges, and it is possible to face the challenges with civil society, and the governmental authorities are important. But as I said, the work that is possible to do with civil society is for me the most important. The civil society every time is overseeing what is happening on the field, not only at the central level, but also in the rural area, in which in Guatemala's case we have challenges to provide. The government has challenges to provide the primary health care services, and I think family planning is an issue that every time is in a competition like another issues, like for example now with COVID-19. And for us as a project is and for civil society with groups that we support is a success to maintain on the public agenda the importance of the family planning. Is a real challenge to maintain in the public agenda the topic and maintain the attention of Congress on civil society and health services, the Ministry of Health, the attention on use the budget in the exactly inputs that we need on family planning. It's not only important, it's very important to have an amount in the budget, but the most important is to monitor what is happening with each cent put it in this budget.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you all for your comments. David, I think the article that you mentioned about the use of birth certificates as a possible measure is an interesting one. I think because as donors or like funders in the health sector, we often wonder, we want to see outcomes. And so how do you actually see outputs for sort of government measures in the health arena without, with something that's with civil society? So the use of using birth certificates as a de facto sort of item that someone can get through the processes of governance is an interesting one. So I actually am really interested in that, and possibly will reach out to you to get a copy of that article or more specifics on it. Moving on, our next question is for Liz. Liz, David mentioned how age structures probably can help identify where a window of opportunity may be opening. Are there examples of countries where these probabilities have been tested or validated?
Sure, yeah, definitely in the governance front, one of the most interesting examples is related to the Arab Spring. So in 2008, a colleague of ours, a political demographer, was making a presentation to a group of US national security experts about how demography does have sort of this predictive power related to where windows of opportunity might be opening. And he suggested that Tunisia was on the verge of becoming a free liberal democracy. And he was literally laughed off the stage for those comments because those regional experts did not believe that there was any chance that the authoritarian regime would be going anywhere anytime soon. Of course, we all saw 3 years later, starting in 2011, the movement in favor, the citizen-driven movement for democracy across North Africa. And unfortunately, 10 years later, Tunisia is the only one of the countries in the region that retains sort of a free or partly free rating as measured by Freedom House's assessment of democracy. And even that is pretty tenuous. But of course, the reason that he made that prediction was because Tunisia has the most advanced median age of any of the countries in the region. Its median age is now in the early 30s, driven by a longstanding legacy of access to family planning, and also just a more progressive, open approach to women's status and women's rights than many of the other countries in the region. Again, demography is just one factor among many, but it is one that has a lot of power when you look at it in this aggregate level and across time.
Thank you, Liz. For Herminia, I think the idea of a playbook is interesting and useful for stakeholders to hold effectively engage in accountability. Your slide shows an image of the OSAR application. How do stakeholders use the data effectively to advance family planning work, especially at a time when there are so many competing priorities in the health sectors to outsize it?
Okay, as I said, we work in now and in the past project on develop capacity of civil society. And now it's very important to provide tools to civil society for many necessities. In this case, OSAR use the data in the app to bolster its public case for family planning. For example, by tracking the number of teenage pregnancy at the national and subnational levels, they can make the case for more youth-friendly services. It is also continuously request data from government institutions on the amount and type of the expenditure of reproductive health resources, and from health service providers on contraceptive supply levels. OSAR then submit the compiled data to different government hearings to request expedited resources allocation for and procurement on family planning supplies. It also shares the data with other decision makers and media outlets. This is some examples about the use that the OSAR can do using the app.
Thank you. So I wanted to just sort of open it up to the audience to see if there was any questions, if folks wanted to raise their hands before we wrapped things up. We have a few more minutes and we wanted to give the audience a little bit more time to see if they had any additional questions. Yes, we have a hand raised by Jay Gribble. Jay, if you want to come on off and ask your question, please.
Sure, thanks, Lillian. This has been really interesting. I think that the what David was talking about, this spillover effect between health programs and governance programs, I think sets a stage for how those of us who work in health can influence other development sectors and perhaps beyond human capital into other ways of fostering better accountability for government's follow through on their commitments. Just wondering, you know, while PACE and HEP Plus have focused on health, perhaps there's some insights into how this spillover effect is influencing other sectors. I mean, so because I think if we're able to bring in education along with health and other sectors and galvanize that commitment through civil society, the stronger development programs can have a lasting impact. So just any thoughts about how we can kind of extend our thinking beyond health and into other sectors where communities have a stake in the outcome and could be working better for follow through on the commitment. Thanks.
Yep. Perhaps Leon, I can try to respond. Yeah. So thank you, Jay, for the question and your thoughts also. I think they're aligned to what we are thinking. The PACE approach actually uses health department as our entry in the work that we do. However, we don't stop just because our focus is on health. We actually support all the 10 sectors in each county. And by supporting them, we mean that in the planning and budgeting process, we have what we call the sector-wide working group meetings where all the 10 sectors meet during the planning process. And essentially it's a time for reflection and also for review of the previous year. And just looking at, for example, water and sanitation, how did this sector affect or relate to health? And what are the issues that are common? For example, the finance that is usually most often not thought of, we also bring them on board because, of course, finance plays a major role. First, not just for providing those resources, but for ensuring that the resources, I think a colleague mentioned, ensuring that every cent is spent to what it was earmarked for. And so we work with the finance through what we call a budget tracking tool, where on a quarterly basis, we are tracking how the finance is tracking how the budgets are performing and providing reports. Those reports, we use them for providing budget policy briefs, which we share widely. And so during the sector working group meeting is actually a discussion, and it's usually a very lively discussion between, among the departments of just seeing how the works relate, education, agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. So, so that we are looking at, if you look at the issues around what are the spillover effects of the work that we do, then you want to appreciate the multisectoral nature that affects health. And so health cannot work in isolation. So I think I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
I think that's a great answer. And if I can just add a couple of things. So number one, I think there's increasing evidence that that type of active citizen behavior does matter in a variety of sectors. I know there's a very good book on education looking at South Africa and Kenya and comparing better outcomes at Kenya, with a much lower per capita investment in the schools, largely being a function of the relationship between the school administration and the communities. And so it related to accountability, but in a more collaborative idea of it than we typically think of it. But I think also just looking at where some of the natural incentives are. And so particularly, in Senegal, there's been a big program that we've been funding for several years, the Governance for Local Development, GOLD, that's really looking at how to support local governance, which includes a variety of different sectors. And there are a lot of parallels in the processes. There's also a lot of advocacy for, money to move out of the center. Everybody thought it was just kind of their particular problem of their ministry that money was not coming down. And often, politicians were kind of playing off different interest groups against each other to say, oh, well, you can't have your money because this sector got it this time. And so working on groups like, associations of, local government authorities or something like that. I think there's some interesting spaces to look at how do the lessons of what has been successful around one of these issues translate, and who is our audience who will amplify that? Who are the peer groups, be it local governance, be it just kind of active citizens, be it where there's a really powerful movement as of, indigenous population rights or something like that, that Armenia spoke to. I think looking at those folks, not just as champions of our issue, but our issue as a contribution to the power of those groups is a different frame. And I think one that we need to get into the habit of having, if we're serious about being locally led, and making ourselves the kind of sidekicks and letting local actors be the real heroes of the story.
Thank you, David. I'm looking at the time and we're running out of time, but I wanted to see if there were any other questions from the audience before we proceeded to close this session. Please feel free to come off of mute. Okay, well, if there are no further questions, I want to again just thank everyone for coming and participating in our session today. I also would like to give a big warm welcome and thanks to our participants, David Jacobson, Chris and Armenia, and Liz. I'm sorry, I'm looking at your face and forgetting to say your name, and Liz Leahy Madison from PACE, from USAID's Population and Reproductive Health Office, as well as our Center for Democracy and Governance. Thank you all for coming and participating in today's panel. Please, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to us, and we will definitely send those comments to our panelists to see if we can get you some responses to your questions. Thanks everyone for participating, and again, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.